All right. Very sorry about that earlier Zoom class, but I have to say, perhaps it really won't make that much of a difference. I think at a certain point, I was pretty much just speaking into a camera anyway. But by the same token, it's nice to get some sense of who you are. I'm going to work this Zoom thing out. It wasn't crucial we have it today. We don't have that much more to talk about since our last class, but in any event, let me do my best to make it right by this little video presentation. I just want to talk about the three cases for those who were able to hear some of what I had to say. The first part of this video will be very familiar. I'm just going to repeat what I said there. The cases are, of course, Zobrest, Agostini, and Zelman. Now, Zobrest and Agostini, as I say, are in a way entanglement cases, though the court does not find any excessive entanglement. And I think they're right to do so. I think there's an interesting progression, as it were, as we move from Lemon to Zobrest to Agostini, how watered down the entanglement worry gets when the court feels, as I said, that there is this clearly identifiable class of beneficiaries who simply exercise their free exercise right in choosing to take their benefit to a religious institution. I think the court is quite right to do everything it can not to find entanglement worries. I should put it this way, not to find whatever entanglement issues arise to be obstacles to, or sufficient reason, I should say, to finding these laws or subsidies or supports unconstitutional. It does intuitively seem quite nuts to think that it would be unconstitutional to supply a hearing impaired person with a sign language interpreter just because the person decides to go to a religious school. This, to me, seems quite wild. If you want this person to have a sign language interpreter, you're going to be pretty easygoing as to where he uses it, or she, of course. On the other hand, it's worth rehearsing what these entanglement issues are. And as I said, they are more substantial, significantly, in my view, more substantial in Agostini than in Zobrest. The Zelman case is not an entanglement case. It's just not an entanglement case. That's a case in which the court worries, rightly, whether this Ohio law, without necessarily intending to have this consequence, nevertheless, whether or not this Ohio law has the effect of supporting religion. The Zelman case, to me, really is, you know, a 50-50 case. I think the arguments there on both sides are pretty good. And in fact, they're probably better on the side of finding this policy unconstitutional, but they're just for once, or I shouldn't say for once, it's one of these relatively rare cases where I think the court is moved by fairly pragmatic considerations and declines to find a constitutional difficulty here. But the Zelman case, I think, just has so many interesting issues going on. It's important in understanding the case, why the court says what it says. It's also important to understand how good the counter arguments are in this case, in a way that I don't think is so in the Zobrest and Agostini case. And where we wind up, you know, so what does it all mean, Professor Ross? Where do we wind up? You know, it's very clear with free exercise. Where we wind up is with a very aggressive and straightforward strict scrutiny test, you know, thanks to Scalia's declining to apply it in Smith and Congress making it mandatory in subsequent such cases. Where do we wind up in the establishment cases? What I want you to take away is the messiness of it. Establishment cases, establishment worries will be with us till the end of time in this country, given, as I say, any taxpayer can raise these objections. You don't have to be a direct party in the way you do in the free exercise cases or the affirmative action cases to raise these challenges. That's one thing that makes this litigation inevitable. And the other thing is just the way in which in this country, understandably, we're constantly tinkering with ways to help people take advantage of their right not to go to public school, but to go to private school, which often means religious schools. And insofar as we have any interest whatsoever in helping people, attend the school of their choice, whether it's the subsidy for transportation you saw in Everson, or this wildly controversial voucher program in Zelman, you can be sure there will always, or how can I put it, from time to time in this country, there'll be a big establishment challenge. This is never going to be resolved in some once and for all way, the way some issues might be. Increasingly less such issues seem to be on the horizon for us, given our political fracturing these days. But certainly establishment seems to me to be just something we will be struggling with in a case-by-case way, for the foreseeable future. And that's what makes the Zelman case particularly interesting, because it's a very good example of a complex fact pattern that sort of divides the non-objectionable and the objectionable considerations more or less equally. Okay, that being said, let's go back to these more straightforward cases, Zobrest and Agostini. All right, Zobrest is remarkably straightforward, perhaps one of the most we ever see in this course, where by now, as you know, there's a policy in which Congress appropriated money for the hearing impaired, such that they will be provided with sign language interpreters if needed in their schooling. And their schooling is the public school if they go to public school, and private school if they go to private school. And if it's a private school, it can be a religious school. And so inevitably somebody objects. Doesn't even have to be the parent of the kid in the school, or it doesn't have to be a neighbor. It doesn't have to be anybody. It just has to be a taxpayer in the state, or in this case, in the country, since it's a federal program. And the court notes that there is some entanglement. There's a kind of authority issue. The government worker must go into a religious institution to provide the service, and when in that building is subject to a certain amount of authority from the religious institution. If you read the case, the dissent brings these examples up, that the government worker might be subjected to a religious institution's dress code, for example. Yeah, it's true. But the court kind of shrugs and says, so we're not going to find this unconstitutional because there's this level of so-called entanglement. This is not a serious obstacle to the fundamental constitutionality of these programs. And as I say, you have to, if you can kind of get your head around this, realize what the consequences would be if the court were per impossible to find the policy in Zobrest, the law in Zobrest, unconstitutional. If they did, they kind of put Zobrest in this Sherbert-like situation where you're saying to the kid, well, you can have the sign language interpreter if you go to public school, but if you act on your religious beliefs and go to your religious school, then you can't. And that's exactly what we saw in Sherbert, is something that would have to be justified by passing strict scrutiny. If you're going to put somebody in that position where they lose a benefit they're otherwise entitled to through religiously motivated conduct, well, then this is something that's going to be looked at pretty closely and justified by a fairly high standard. Now, we're not in a religious free exercise case here. This is an establishment case. But my only point is, if the decision had gone the other way, Zobrest would kind of have a free exercise claim along Sherbert-like lines, saying, wait a minute, I could get this benefit if I don't act on my religious beliefs. That's great. That's what it is to respect religion in this country. Then you better be able to justify this by passing some version of a strict scrutiny test. All right, on to Agostini. Agostini for those of you that could hear during that awful Zoom class and the terrible sound quality, presents a more complicated, troubling fact pattern. We have a policy in which the government provides remedial education to those students who need it. And once again, this benefit follows the students, if you will, to whatever school they go to. In New York State, because there were prohibitions because of earlier cases, law. I'm trying to remember what the name of the case is. It's mentioned in the Agostini case, but Aguilar could be. I think it's Aguilar. It was found that the government worker, the remedial teacher, it's a government worker, since they're paid by the government, should not, for fear of engendering entanglement worries, be actually in the church building. I'll just say church, but of course it could be a synagogue or any other religious institution, school. Should not be in the church building. And so Quonset huts were set up outside the schools in which the students who needed remedial education would leave the church building, go to these little, huts, classrooms that were set up just outside the school. And allegedly, by these kinds of provisions, entanglement worries were avoided. In subsequent case law, and obviously I won't say the irrationality, but the impracticality of this expense troubled the government. The Clinton administration resisted having to build these extra structures in order to provide this benefit to the students who needed it. And subsequent case law said, we're not going to presume that simply because the government worker is in the church building, there's an entanglement worry, or I should put it this way, that the entanglement is such that the policy the government worker is there to enact will be unconstitutional. There was a finding that the government worker could be in the church building without this constituting a per se violation. Obviously, Zobrest is congruent with that as well. That sign language interpreter has to be in the classroom signing as the teacher speaks, or you're not doing your job. So now we have the same, it's kind of like Zobrest, we have the same worry. Does the provision of this benefit students wrongly support religion? Well, the court says no. And once again, the fundamental point here that you got to kind of have in your head if I ask a question about Zobrest and Agostini is, if there's a class of beneficiaries that can be identified apart from any religious description, then that Congress or the relevant legislative body wishes to provide a benefit to, then the court's going to try very hard to see that they get that benefit, as is only right. Now, in Agostini, because the government worker is providing remedial education, you have all the trivial worries that arise in Zobrest. Is the government worker subject to a dress code, for example? There might be some other things that are raised in Zobrest, but I can't remember what they would be. In addition to those, something arises in Agostini we don't see in Zobrest. And some of you may have heard this in the Zoom class. Most of you probably didn't, but that is this. In the sign language case, the translator is simply conveying what the teacher is doing anyway. The teacher's job life remains identical. Much the same way, if there was somebody signing what I'm doing now to a hearing impaired person, this doesn't affect my lecturing, my teaching at all. By contrast, the remedial education teacher does the same kind of teaching as the teacher in the religious institution. He's just doing a little bit of what that religious teacher would have done to the very same students in the very same subjects. And so there's an undeniable sense in which the remedial education teacher is doing some of the work that would otherwise fall to the religious instructor. I mean, I put that very badly, but I'm sure if you think about it, it's pretty obvious. So suppose I'm teaching math in the religious school. There's a math class as well as whatever else going on. And I have in my class of 30, 5 kids who are really struggling. Well, I'd have to meet with them and see what I could do to help them and, go over their work and try and figure out what tips to give them and so forth and so on, because they're my students and I want to see them do as well as possible, obviously. Now, the government worker comes along and says, I'll do the remedial work. I'll help you out here. I'm skilled and trained and, I can do 5th grade math for those who are having trouble with it. So I'll do it. So now these 5 students that I would have met with after class or gone over the exam with, whatever, you get the point. The government worker is taking that up. I might still do it, but obviously some of the work that would otherwise fall to me, the government worker is doing. That's a kind of entanglement, and the court doesn't deny it. But they say, very far from the spirit of the Lemon case, okay, it's entanglement. But is it excessive entanglement? No. There's always entanglement, they say. There's always some entanglement, but it's not excessive. Whereas in the Lemon case, you had this sense that entanglement was a sort of standalone norm. You just didn't want the government and the church institutions to have very much to do with one another. You just didn't want it. It had very little to do with any consequences or what the benefits were. That doesn't even come in to any sort of assessment process in the Lemon case. They're not saying, but on the other hand, there's all these benefits to the citizens of the state by having the religious schools offer more robust secular education. They never go there. They just put forward this norm, this aspiration, this ideal, no entanglement, separation of church and state. In Agostini, you see this is really being backed away from or derogated. It's no longer the kind of high-flown language where we wrap ourselves in the flag and say, we, the United States government, never enmesh ourselves or entangle ourselves with these church institutions. In the Agostini case, it's really more like, well, yeah, there's a little bit of entanglement. Indeed, there is. I'm teaching some of your students. I'm helping you out with your job. That's pretty serious, connectedness. But it's no longer called excessive entanglement. Because again, and this is why, reading Zobrest first is a bit of a help, the norm that they're really gripped by, and as I keep saying, I think they're right to be gripped by, is we want to give the kids the benefit that they would get if they weren't in a religious institution. Otherwise, as I say, you kind of back into this free exercise problem. So the court would take a lot more than merely my doing a little bit of the work that you would otherwise be doing in order to find this policy unconstitutional. And so the policy of supporting remedial education, even when that student's in a religious school, is found constitutional. And I think, as I say, these cases aren't going to occupy us very much because I think the court's basically right. It's a very, if you like, pro-democratic decision. The notion of entanglement is understood to be no longer, as it is in Lemon, this extremely demanding bar, this demanding obstacle that must be overcome. Rather, it's a very loose plastic notion that is typically overpowered by our worries about being good Democrats, in the sense that we want everybody who is a member of this class that is identified as a worthy recipient of this aid to get it. That's what we want. Everybody who needs remedial education is going to get it. Everybody who needs a sign language interpreter is going to get it. And that's the fundamental norm driving these decisions. Fine. Now, Zelman. Well, Zelman let's just go over the facts. The city of Cleveland, it's either, I think it's the early 90s, could be the mid 90s. Yeah, 95. So it's very much the mid 90s. Is the schools in Cleveland are at this point dysfunctional, broke. I think there's a kind of receivership going on. It's a recognized crisis that is being taken up now by the state of Ohio, which passes this legislation that gives the parents it's actually a complicated voucher program. If you're below the poverty line, you get, I think, 2,500. I have some notes here. Let me just have a look at this. You have, it's 2,250, but I can't see what difference that makes. If you're below the poverty line, you get a voucher, which you can use worth 2,250 in participating private schools. This is supposed to help you get out of the dysfunctional, what's the word I want, non-performing public schools of Cleveland, and take advantage of this opportunity to go to schools that are not so, what's the word, bereft of resources and the like. I believe the voucher program is a little more subtle than the court's, the abridged version of this decision lets you think. I think there's a lesser subsidy, say 1,500, for those who are at something like 50% over the poverty line and so forth. So those who are poor but not absolutely poor get something as well, not as much, and so forth and so on. But it doesn't, I think, matter all that much for the difficulty with the voucher program. Parents can then take this, say, 2,250 voucher to any school, any private school that admits their child, and get a 2,250 credit against the tuition. Well, even though something like 80% of the schools that participate are religious and 20% are not, the students wind up in religious schools 96% of the time. Almost all of them are in religious schools. Why? Well, it's obvious, because the religious schools are cheaper. And if you're poor and you don't have a lot of money, otherwise, you really can only go to the schools where the tuition is essentially what the voucher is. And that will only be the religious schools. There are some exceptions. Some of these students get scholarships at non-religious private schools, scholarships that'll make up the difference between the voucher and what the tuition is. There are some exceptions. I'm sure there are some parents / students who will just about die before they go to a religious school. So they're not there either. But when you have this wildly skewed outcome, when 96% of the students with these vouchers wind up in religious schools, you have a lawsuit. This is kind of interesting. Nobody looking at the program as such has a lawsuit. It's only in virtue of the way it worked out. If, as a matter of fact, if, enough of these people had other resources or got loans or whatever, such that the number of students in these schools was roughly the same percentage as the percentage of those schools, there wouldn't be a lawsuit. If, just to repeat, if, say, only 85% of these students wound up in religious schools, then it kind of looks like, okay, that's the number of schools, the percentage of schools out there, that's the number of students who are in these schools, seems about right. But because it's so far from that, that almost all of these students wind up in religious schools, a lawsuit is brought. On what grounds? Not that this legislation intended to support religion. That's not it. That's an interesting feature of this case. It's just that it had the effect, to use the language of the Lemon holding. Legislation cannot have the effect of supporting religion. Not just does the legislation intend. Nobody's saying that. The legislation clearly intends just to help the kids. That's what it's there to do. But because of the way it's structured on one hand and the facts in the world on the other, it's a reasonable thing to say this is unconstitutional. Not because it has a bad heart or a bad head. It's not like it's got the wrong thought in its head. It's just that when you turn the crank of causation and this program is put in place and the stuff that's out there have the tuition price tags that it has, you're supporting religion. That's what's kind of interesting here. It's not a claim about, among other things, it's not a claim about what Ohio intended. It's not like there's some, possible bias or interest in supporting religion. Nobody's saying that. There's just no evidence for that. And, they're just in the grip of trying to help the students in Cleveland's inner city schools. They're not thinking about this, but they're not thinking about helping out the Catholic schools. It's not their thought. But given the way things are, they have. And as I said in the Zoom class, but it probably was lost, notice this too. Notice another contrast with Lemon that goes against the constitutionality of this program. In Lemon, the legislation, which was direct aid to the schools, without doubt. Nevertheless, this aid was highly conditional or qualified. It was all about supporting teaching secular subjects with secular course books. And I'm not going to rehearse all the other constraints and restrictions, but these vouchers, it's unrestricted money. If you go to that Catholic school and give them the voucher, this is just like a gift. They just have it. It's part of their assets. It goes into their bank account. They can use it any way they see fit. It's unrestricted money. Okay. Now, of course, the court goes back to Everson and says, well, but it's to the parents. We're not giving it to the church itself. The court just really turns the Everson crank and says, this is just to the parents. Our case law is clear. If we're not supporting the school directly, but giving this benefit to the parents, then the government isn't implicated. It's like a money laundering thing. We give this money to the parents. What the parents do with it, that's their business. There's nothing wrong with this policy. We give the money to the parents, and then the parents decide. And in that free decision is this kind of washing or laundering of any wrongfulness or unconstitutionality on the part of the government or on the part of this policy. That's the essence of this decision. I give this money to the parents. What they do, that's what they do. You can't call the government a wrongdoer because they're not giving it directly to the church. Okay. On the other side, obviously, under the circumstances, in what sense are these parents freely choosing religious over non-religious schools? The whole idea of free choice is so obscure in this case, and everybody knows it. In what sense are you free, to come up with another $1,500 when you're poor, when you're broke? In what sense are you freely choosing X over Y when you can afford X and you can't afford Y? It's like saying, well, yeah, I don't live in Brentwood. I just live in an apartment in Brooklyn. That's my free choice, I just freely choose. Well, you can say that, but we all know it's nonsense. I don't have the money to live in Brentwood. I don't have the money to live on Park Avenue. I don't freely choose not to live on Park Avenue in any coherent sense that I can articulate. And that's what's going on here. These parents aren't freely choosing these religious schools. And one of the dissenters, I think, it could have been a concurrence, but I believe it was a dissenter, points out, says, in a case like this, a significant percentage of these people, they're going to these schools not out of any religious conviction. This isn't like Zobrest, who we assume could have attended a perfectly satisfactory public school and chooses to go to a religious school out of his own religious convictions. So sure, that sign language interpreter should follow him. But in this case, many of these parents, we can presume, I'm sure this is a correct assumptions, they're sending their kids to these religious schools because it's the school they can afford. The public school has failed them. They can't afford a non-religious private school, so they go to a religious school. They may have absolutely no interest in their child getting a religious education, but they'll hold their nose and swallow and take it because they're going to get an education along with it. And that's in the case too. Everybody knows this. To call this acting on religious conviction in many cases is strange. Nobody's acting, or I shouldn't say nobody. I'm sure for some it's like, what a blessing. God has been good to us. I always wanted to send little Johnny to a religious school, and now the government has given me $2,500 to help me do it. Fantastic. But I think in many other cases, and nobody denies this, it's like, well, it looks like you're going to a religious school, Johnny, because that's the one we can afford. So just handle it. Just live with it. And it'll be okay with me if you don't do so well in your theology classes. There's a lot of that going to happen too. Okay, in what sense then is this, as the court says it is? Is the parent really freely choosing to use this voucher however they like? As I said, I think, and we'll see this again. Where will we see this again? I'm trying to think where economic coercion comes in one of the cases. I know it's down the road. There is another case of a social coercion case in the speech case when we take up the Citizens United. But just generally, I think the court is very bad, just generally, about social causation. They don't quite know how to fit it into a legal framework. And they're not very good. Well, I think our liberal democracy is not very good at making sense of what you might call degrees of intentionality. I mean, obviously, these poor people, when choosing the private school, it's not like somebody has threatened them with a gun or threatened them with a legal penalty. They're not being coerced in this very obvious, strong sense. In fact, I wouldn't even say they're being coerced. That's just is not the right way to talk about it. I'm not coerced when I, rent the apartment that I rent. But I do think there is causation. I do think that it's quite absurd to assimilate these kinds of decisions, which are made under extremely significant economic causal pressures, to some sort of unproblematically free decision. And everybody knows it. Everybody knows it. And it's hard for the court to acknowledge that. They have to treat what the parents do as just like what Zobrest does. I think what Zobrest does is that. Zobrest just freely decides to go to the religious school. That's that. That's about as free a choice, so far as we know. Let's just, to make my point, allow for it. Zobrest thinks, yeah, I'm in, some well-off suburb. My public school is fine. I'm going to this religious school not because there's any educational difference. I'm just a believer in my faith. I want to, go to school where that's going on as well as learning about, math and science and European history. Fine. That's a free choice. Is that what's going on in Zelman when the parent, brings the voucher to the Catholic school? I don't think so. And the dissent doesn't think so either. And, I don't think any sociologist would think so. And this is a classic case of what I would call constrained choice, or choice made under significant causal forces, which in turn incline, if not exactly determine, the outcome. And that's why, 4 out of the 9 think this policy is unconstitutional, because it's just the case that, again, not because it has a bad heart or anything, but just given the causal mechanisms that are out there, given what things cost, given what the poor have, this legislation just drives them like, animals being herded. They're just driven into these schools. They really are causally, I don't quite know what the word is I don't want to say forced, but they're certainly heavily influenced by the relevant causal forces that are indeed operative. And that's what brings the worry. It's very interesting. And the court just can't, they never use that language. But we all know that's the reason there's a problem. Is that people who don't have a lot of money and are given a certain amount of money by the government are going to use it to buy the item out there that is priced in alignment with that gift, that subsidy. And in this case, it's the religious school. If you really wanted to make free choice, you should have just said to them, find the school that gets you and we'll pay the tuition. And then the government pays for, choate, if you get into choate, and stumps up the 40 grand if you get into choate. And if you want to go to Our Lady of the Sacred Heart, then yeah, 2,500 for you. That's what would make it free. That would really make it free. Then you just apply, see where you get in, and the state picks up the tab. But we don't do it that way. And then you got establishment worries. Because if it's a fixed amount of money and not a great amount of money, then those who are pricing their product at the lower end are going to scoop it all up. If this were cars, I don't think anybody would care. But it's a religious education. That's what's going on. And of course, the reason that it's cheap, we've been through this, is because the faculty, often members of the clergy, do this work for a fraction of the costs that somebody who's not a member of the clergy would do. So it's not as if the inexpensive price tag is utterly unconnected to it being a religious order. It's not like these people are just some wildly efficient characters, some sort of free market fantasy. Oh, yeah, we know how to offer this education cheap, and yet it's just as good. No, it's just some people aren't being paid a living wage because they don't need it. They're living, in the monastery, or they're taken care of by the church with other funds. They don't need the salary to live. So, of course, the price is different, and the price is in alignment with the voucher. Okay, so I think that's it on that case. You can see why it's a really problematic case. And as I say, it was closely divided in the lower court and then divided in the Supreme Court. The reasons to find it constitutional are, I think, the following. And I have to kind of suppress my smile when I say this. You can say the government is just giving this money to the parents. Well, they don't the parents never see the money, actually. They have a voucher. They never get this money in their account or anything. When they attend a school, the school then cashes that voucher in. That's how it works. But be that as it may, the parents are given this kind of discount towards whatever the tuition is. That's what it is. So if you go to a school that's charging $22.50, you don't get a bill. If you're going to a school that charges $4, then you get a bill for $17.50. That's what it is. So you can say that, pursuant to Everson, a benefit given to the parents, not to the school. It's not like the policy, like it was in Lemon, directly gives this money to the school. That's, I think, the essence of the argument that it's constitutional. The argument to the contrary has several strands. One is, yeah, you're giving it to the parents, but the parents hardly freely use this voucher, given the economic causation story I've rehearsed. And secondly, another worry, doesn't come up much in the reading you had, but it's there. This money is unrestricted. When the parents do use this money, as they do, the church gets it without strings. They are perfectly entitled to use that extra money. They're going to get more students than they had. It's a bit of a bumper year for the private schools, the church schools. They're getting, more students and bringing in this tuition dollar, and they can use that extra money however they like. So the unrestricted nature of the funds and let's just say the murkiness surrounding the claim that this is a free choice of the parents are the reasons to say whatever was in your heart, state of Ohio, when you pass this law, it has the effect of supporting religion. Now, I actually sort of think, because I think the economic causation worry is very real. And I think to the extent that the dissent picked up on it, it's like good for them, because the court and lawyers generally like to think we're in some sort of Lockean fantasy where people just kind of retreat to some absolutely uncoerced place and, look inward. They reflect and marinate in their consciousness and figure out what they truly, freely want to do, and then go on and do it. Yeah. When that picture of choice and decision has an unfortunate kind of primacy in our, whatever you might want to call it, liberal capitalist democracy. And look, in some cases, it's a perfectly reasonable paradigm. When you're deciding how to spend your extra money on leisure, whether you're going to go out to dinner or go to a movie, yeah, you're just going to freely decide. But in this kind of case, I think the idea of this being a free decision when you don't have the resources to buy anything but the religious product, that's, I think, a fantasy. And to their credit, the 4 in this 5-4 decision see that. So that's where we are. I think, well, I should say one further thing. This is also kind of obvious. I think the court wants to help the kids. So they're willing to kind of just make a bad argument. Because in the end, to find this policy unconstitutional means these kids don't go to those schools, and they're thrown back into this dysfunctional system. So Clarence Thomas writes, he rarely writes much, but he says something along these lines. It's like, are we really not going to let these kids go to better schools? That's crazy. Of course we are. So I think it's just one of these cases where the failures of our public institutions, in this case, the city of Cleveland, makes the court willing to kind of soften or kind of close one eye and squint a bit at, I was going to say, soften its demands on legislation when subject to an establishment challenge, or, if you will, fudge and somewhat misdescribe the nature of free choice in this context. But in this case, I mean, there'll be cases where we have some bad decisions. They're coming up, the civil rights cases of 1872. There's some horrible arguments there. And it's not implausible to think that they're motivated by racism or by an inability to really feel their way into the urgency of what was required in post-Civil War America. Fine. In this case, the bad argument, to the extent it is a bad argument or flawed, and there is clearly some extent to which it is, it's motivated by a genuinely worthy desire to help these kids. So that's what you have here, a kind of willingness to fudge, describe these basically powerless poor people as free as anybody ever is or could be in order to enable them at least to get the benefit of this program. Final point, this is not an entanglement case. It's not an entanglement case. It's a case in which the court worries simply, does this legislation have the effect of supporting religion? And in this case, very good arguments on both sides. I think it goes down the way it does because the court really wants to help the kids. And so we'll just affirm the argument that does so, even though it's, flawed. To characterize what the parents do as free choice is, I think, subject to challenge. And, that's why the case splits 5-4. All right. I'm going to stop it there. That's really pretty much it. Please, write me if you have any further questions. We're going to talk next about the civil rights cases of 1872. Fantastic stuff. I have to say, I never even heard of these cases until I started teaching this class. And I promise you, you will never forget it. And this is just remarkable, remarkably interesting. The legislation that's here being challenged, terrific. So check it out. We'll figure out the next Zoom. And in the meantime, thanks for bearing with me. Bye for now.